All right, we're getting closer to the end. We've got about these two chapters and two more chapters that follow up next week. The work next week is not nearly as heavy, so I'll get you ready for that. This week we're going to be dealing with chapter 33 of Mounce, and this deals with the imperative mood. Imperative mood is not difficult, but it is. There are some things that you do need to learn about it, and if you learn those few things, you should be able to handle it without any problem at all. So getting started, I would say let's be sure to read the exegetical insight. Those are always helpful, so take a look at that. Then be sure to compare the English and Greek grammar, because that helps you to remember what the tenses and moods, like the imperative, are like in English, and it's easier to understand something about the Greek when you compare the grammar for both the languages. So I'd take a look at that. And then I also want to remind you that you are continuing to build on what you've already learned. So there's not much new to learn here at all. There are a few things to learn about the imperative mood, and there are some endings, but the endings are very simple. If you can just remember this brief paradigm: blank, to, te, tosan. Now, if you will remember that, to, te, tosan, and then blank, sto, ste, stosan. And then when you get to the aorist tense, you'll remember that you put the mark of the aorist in the active and middle, and then the mark of the aorist passive in as well. So you've already learned all those things. The only thing you need to learn is that to, te, tosan, sto, ste, stosan. So you'll see that when you get to the paradigms, which we'll mention in just a moment. The imperative is the mood of command. Not the only way to give a command in Greek, but it is the most common way, and certainly is the most easily recognizable. A part of the good news about the imperative is that it only occurs in the present and the aorist, so you don't have a lot of tenses to deal with here. Remember also that we're in a non-indicative mood, which simply means that there is no time factor involved in this. So you have the simple forms: blank, to, te, tosan for the present indicative, which is what we start off with, and then blank, sto, ste, stosan for the present, middle, and passive. The aorist is very similar. You add the sigma alpha in the active and middle. The passive, as is usual, is different for the aorist, and note the comparison in section 33.8, and this will become very clear to you. I recommend that you copy and keep, and as well as try to learn to recognize at least the charts on pages 311 and 12. And note especially in 33.9 that there are some forms that are the same for the indicative and the imperative. There are a few places like John 14, the early verses of John 14, where that could technically be interpreted either way, but the context is generally what helps you, and as it does in that situation. So memorize the endings. Let me emphasize that. Memorize those endings that are listed at 33.6. I'll mention that again, but be sure to memorize that: to, te, tosan, sto, ste, stosan. If you just know that, then you should be able to handle the imperative without any problem. And then learn to recognize the forms in the paradigms in section 33.8. Just to learn to recognize and translate those. If you learn those endings, to, te, tosan, sto, ste, stosan, then you shouldn't have any problem with that if you learn to recognize these others. Read section 33.9 through 33.14 very carefully. There's a lot of good information there. Note in 33.15 through 33.17 the meaning of the imperative. That will be helpful to you. And then read carefully about the various ways of expressing prohibition and negation. And now read and note what Mounce has to say, because that will help you. Just remember where it is. If you need to go back and review it, you can do it. I would not spend a lot of time trying to memorize all of the facts that are there, but just read it carefully and pay close attention to that. You may want to add this section, some of these things here, to your notebook, and you can certainly call on those when you're translating later on. You'll also want to keep the summary in your notebook. That is very helpful. So the summary in chapter 33, you want to make sure that you copy and keep in your notebook. Again, I remind you, memorize the endings in the table chart on page 315. That is that's very important. And then I also encourage you to read carefully the section on advanced information on page 317. You'll find that to be helpful as well. Some final words on chapter 33. Keep collecting the charts. Remember, learn your vocabulary. We're going to look at that in just a moment. Memorize the imperative endings, as I've already mentioned a couple of times, for the active and middle passive. You also are going to need to memorize your aorist endings. I mean, the endings are all the same. Toe, blank, toe, te, toe sign, blank, sto, stes, sto sign. Just that's what you want to memorize. Then read the advanced information and do exercise 33 in your workbook as it is usually assigned, pars 1 through 10, and then translate sentences 4 through 8 of chapter 33. So let's look quickly, if we might, in chapter 33 at the vocabulary. You don't have a lot of vocabulary, but you do want to memorize these words. These will be some important words. The first one is, we're on page 316, is apollomy. And then the second one is apoluo. You'll want to note the differences and similarities in those. And then the other word of your vocabulary in chapter 33 is ate. So you be sure to note that. But if you work on those things, you should be able to work through this chapter pretty quickly, because you have already learned most of it. So we'll talk to you again on chapter 34.